The radio call came in fractured. Not from interference. From movement. The signal was there. Then gone. Then there again, 3 seconds, maybe 4. Enough for a Predator drone orbiting at 15,000 feet to lock, hesitate, and lose it. Below, the mountains absorbed everything. Tora Bora did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a collapse. Black rock, vertical ridgelines, narrow passes cut by centuries of wind. Elevation above 13,000 feet. Oxygen thin enough to slow decision-making. Temperature dropping below freezing after sunset. Every sound carried. Every movement exposed. Somewhere inside that terrain, Osama bin Laden was walking. They had everything. CIA Special Activities Division paramilitaries embedded with Afghan militias. Delta Force operators from 1st SFODD positioned along key ridgelines. Predator drones feeding live video to command nodes in Bagram and further back to CENTCOM. Signals intelligence units, Task Force Orange, monitoring courier traffic, satellite phone bursts, fragmented voice intercepts. They could hear him. At least, they thought they could. A voice transmission picked up on December 13th, Arabic. Calm. Directing fighters. It matched previous patterns. Analysts flagged it. Confidence high. JSOC pushed the assessment upward. The chain moved quickly. Bagram to Tampa. Tampa to Washington. Authorization came down the same way it always did. Controlled. Measured. Distant. Contain. Fix. Finish. But containment requires closure. And Tora Bora had none. Delta operators moved at night, climbing narrow goat trails with 80-pound loads. M4 carbines, suppressed. And /PVS, 14 night vision devices cutting through darkness that still felt too thick. They could see shapes. They could not see systems. The Afghan fighters, under Hazrat Ali and other local commanders, advanced differently. Faster. Louder. Familiar with the terrain, but not aligned in purpose. Some fought for money. Some for influence. Some simply because they always had. Coordination was not a given. It was negotiated. Constantly. Above them, B-52 bombers released JDAMs onto cave complexes mapped from outdated Soviet-era intelligence. The explosions reshaped the mountain. But the mountain did not care. Inside those caves, movement continued. The assumption held. He was trapped. Every briefing reinforced it. Every intercepted signal seemed to confirm it. The noose was tightening. The exits were covered. Except they weren't. Not all of them. Because on the eastern edge of the White Mountains, the terrain didn't end. It thinned. It fractured into high-altitude passes leading quietly into Pakistan. No fences. No permanent observation posts. Just snow, rock, and routes known only to those who had used them for decades. The system saw a box. The mountain saw a door. And somewhere between those two realities, the target kept moving. They escalated everything. More aircraft. More surveillance. More pressure on the same assumptions. By December 10th, the airspace above Tora Bora was saturated. B-52 Stratofortresses orbited in wide arcs, dropping 2,000-pound dams guided by GPS coordinates that were only as accurate as the intelligence feeding them. AC-130 gunships rotated in after dusk, their 105mm howitzers walking fire across suspected cave entrances. The mountain shook. The system interpreted that as progress. It wasn't. On the ground, Delta Force reconnaissance elements from 1st SFODD had already identified the limitation. They were not fighting a fixed position. They were chasing a moving network. Small groups of Al-Qaeda fighters were breaking contact before airstrikes landed, using pre-surveyed escape routes that ran laterally across the ridgelines rather than down into the valleys where Afghan militias expected them. The pattern repeated. Contact. Delay. Disappear. Each time, the response was heavier. More bombs. More urgency. CIA Special Activities Division teams attempted to stabilize the Afghan advance. Cash payments increased. Commitments were reinforced. But loyalty in that environment was transactional, not structural. Hazrat Ali's fighters would push forward during daylight, then pause at nightfall, consolidating positions instead of sealing routes. Night movement belonged to those who understood the terrain without needing to see it. And those weren't the Americans. Delta requested blocking positions along the southern and eastern passes. Small, surgical deployments. Insert teams onto the high ground. Cut off exfiltration routes into Pakistan. The proposal moved up through JSOC channels. It slowed. The decision point didn't sit on the mountain. It sat in command centers hundreds of miles away. Concerns were raised. Political boundaries. Pakistani sovereignty. Escalation risk. The request did not disappear. It just didn't convert into action. So the gaps remained. Task Force Orange continued to intercept communications. Short bursts. Satellite phones activated for seconds, sometimes less. Enough to triangulate approximate locations, never enough to fix them with certainty. Each intercept fed the same narrative. He was still there. Confidence remained high. Too high. The system needed him to be inside the box. Every operational layer was built around that assumption. Air power shaped it. Afghan militias compressed it. Intelligence confirmed it. But confirmation wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from patterns interpreted at distance. On December 12th, a series of intercepts suggested movement toward the southeast ridge. Analysts flagged it as possible repositioning within the cave network. Not withdrawal, not escape, just internal maneuver. That interpretation held for hours. Long enough, because on the ground, movement looked different. It wasn't vertical. It was lateral. Small groups moving across snow-covered saddles at elevations above 11,000 feet. No radios. No lights. Guides who had walked those routes since childhood, navigating by memory and silhouette. They weren't repositioning. They were leaving. Delta teams observed signs. Fresh tracks in areas that had not been targeted. Heat signatures briefly captured on infrared, then lost as they moved into dead ground between drone orbits. The pattern didn't fit the briefing. They reported it anyway. Up the chain, the information degraded. Not intentionally. Structurally. Each layer filtered for coherence, not contradiction. Reports that aligned with the containment model moved faster. Reports that challenged it required validation. Validation takes time. Time was the only resource the target needed. By the night of December 13th, the bombardment reached its peak. Continuous strikes. Minimal pause. The assumption was pressure would force a mistake. Force exposure. Force surrender. Instead, it created noise. Too much noise. Inside that noise, movement became invisible. Afghan units reported sporadic contact, then silence. Some positions were abandoned without explanation. Others claimed success without verification. The front line wasn't a line. It was a series of disconnected points, each operating on its own understanding of the battle. Coordination degraded further. Requests for reinforcement came in late or not at all. Communication relied on intermediaries, translators, local commanders, promises that shifted with the terrain. And still, the central belief held. He was contained. On December 14th, senior leadership assessed the situation as nearing completion. Enemy resistance was collapsing. Cave complexes were being neutralized. The operational picture suggested closure. But closure requires control of exits. And no one was physically on those exits. Not in force. Not with permanence. Just assumptions, reinforced by distance. Somewhere beyond the southeastern ridgelines, beyond the last effective observation point, the terrain dipped toward Pakistan's tribal areas. No air coverage could persist continuously. No ground unit had been placed to seal it. It existed in the operational map as a boundary. In reality, it was a corridor. And corridors don't announce themselves. They wait. The system had compressed everything inward. Firepower, attention, belief. But pressure without containment does one thing very well. It pushes. And on that mountain, under that pressure, something was already moving out. The problem was never the mountain. The problem was the model imposed onto it. From the first briefing, the operational picture had been simplified into something manageable. A fixed enemy. A defined battle space. A closing perimeter. It made sense inside a command center. It did not survive contact with terrain that had never obeyed borders. They believed he was inside Tora Bora. That assumption wasn't careless. It was built from signals intelligence, human reporting, intercepted communications. Task Force Orange had tracked courier patterns. CIA Special Activities Division had debriefed local sources who pointed toward the White Mountains. Even the voice intercepts seemed to confirm presence. Individually, each data point held weight. Together, they created certainty. And certainty replaced verification. The problem was not intelligence failure. The problem was interpretation. Signals intelligence provided fragments. Seconds of audio. Coordinates with margins of error measured in kilometers across vertical terrain. Human sources offered direction, not precision. Afghan commanders reported what they saw, but also what they believed the Americans expected to hear. The system fused all of it into a single conclusion. He was there, but presence is not position. And position, in that environment, changed by the hour. The second assumption followed naturally. If he was there, then he could be contained. Containment, in conventional doctrine, relies on layered control. Outer cordons. Inner blocking positions. continuous observation, denial of movement across all axes. None of that existed in Tora Bora. There was no outer cordon on the Pakistani border, no permanent blocking force on the high-altitude passes, no continuous ground surveillance across the ridgelines that actually mattered. The Afghan militias controlled valleys and lower slopes, not the escape routes that required acclimatization and intimate terrain knowledge. Delta Force teams understood this early. Their operational language was precise. They didn't describe the enemy as trapped. They described the terrain as porous. They requested insertion points not for assault, but for denial. Small units placed on likely exfiltration routes. Quiet, persistent, invisible. The request moved through JSOC. It encountered a different logic. Risk was calculated horizontally, not vertically. Political boundaries carried more weight than terrain realities. Crossing into positions that might influence Pakistani territory required authorization that extended beyond the battlefield. The decision chain stretched from Bagram to CENTCOM, then further into civilian leadership. Time expanded inside that chain. On the mountain, time contracted. Every hour without physical presence on those passes widened the gap between assumption and reality. The third assumption was the most subtle. Firepower would compensate for uncertainty. B-52 strikes, AC, 130 gun runs, continuous bombardment of cave complexes. These were not random. They were based on mapped positions, historical data from Soviet campaigns, and updated coordinates from drone surveillance. The logic was simple. Apply enough pressure, and the target would either be destroyed or forced into the open. But pressure without visibility creates displacement. The cave systems were not isolated chambers. They were networks. Entrances connected by internal passages, exits opening onto different faces of the mountain. Bombing one entrance did not seal the system. It rerouted it. Every strike changed the terrain. Not just physically, but behaviorally. Al-Qaeda fighters adapted in real time. They reduced radio usage, limiting exposure to signals intelligence. They shifted movement to night hours, when even Predator drones struggled with terrain masking. They abandoned predictable routes, using guides who understood microterrain features invisible to satellite imagery. They did not resist the pressure. They moved with it, and the system misread that movement. Reports of reduced resistance were interpreted as degradation. Intercepts became less frequent, which reinforced the belief that communication networks were collapsing. Afghan units encountered fewer fighters in expected positions, suggesting retreat deeper into the mountains. All of it pointed inward. Nothing pointed outward, because outward movement required a different lens. It required accepting that the target was not defending a position. He was managing an exit. That idea conflicted with the dominant narrative. Every operational layer had invested in the containment model. Air power, ground coordination, intelligence analysis, all aligned around the same structure. To challenge, it was to introduce uncertainty at the worst possible moment. So the system filtered it out. Delta teams reported tracks leading toward the southeastern ridgelines. Not heavy movement. Small groups. Disciplined spacing. No signs of panic. That detail mattered. It suggested planning, not collapse. The reports were logged. They did not redefine the operation, because redefining the operation required shifting from destruction to interdiction, from striking targets to blocking routes, from overwhelming force to precise placement. That shift never happened. Instead, the operation intensified in the wrong dimension. More strikes, more pressure, more confirmation bias. The problem was not a lack of capability. It was the alignment of that capability with an incorrect frame. They had built a system designed to crush a static enemy. They were facing one that moved. And movement, in that terrain, did not need speed. It needed direction. By the time the system began to question the model had already shaped the outcome. The mountain had never been a prison. It was a transit point, and the exits had been open from the beginning. There was another way to fight that mountain. It did not begin with aircraft. It did not begin with pressure. It began with absence. Units like the British Special Air Service had spent years operating in environments where the map was never accurate and the enemy was never fixed. In Oman's Dhofar War, in the hills of Northern Ireland, later in Helmand, they learned a different principle. Control does not come from presence everywhere. It comes from presence where it matters. A four-man SAS patrol, inserted by Chinook at night, would not move toward the loudest point of contact. It would move toward the quietest route out. High ground overlooking likely exfiltration corridors. Not to engage immediately. To watch. To confirm patterns. To build a picture that did not depend on reports moving through layers of command. Observation first, action later. The Americans had units capable of that. Delta Force operated on similar principles when allowed to. Small reconnaissance elements, often no more than a troop reinforced with sniper teams, inserted ahead of main effort. Equipped with suppressed M4A1 carbines, State Route 25 precision rifles, laser designators for close air support if needed. But their primary function in terrain like Tora Bora was not to strike. It was to deny movement. That required a different chain of command behavior. Instead of pushing requests upward for authorization at each step, the doctrine relied on pre-delegated authority. Mission command. Intent defined at the top. Execution controlled at the lowest possible level. The patrol leader on the ridge decides when to interdict, not a command post hundreds of kilometers away. Because by the time a decision travels back down, the target has already moved. In Afghanistan, that philosophy existed in fragments. CIA Special Activities Division teams had built relationships with local tribes in other regions using long-term human intelligence networks. They understood that terrain like Tora Bora was not just physical. It was social. Routes were controlled by families, not maps. Movement required permission, or at least familiarity. A different approach would have started weeks earlier. Insertion of small SAD teams into the eastern valleys, not to hunt immediately, but to map human terrain. Identify which tribes controlled which passes. Who could be paid? Who could not? Establish quiet observation posts overlooking routes that did not appear on standard military maps. Simultaneously, Delta reconnaissance elements would be inserted not onto the main ridgelines facing the cave complexes, but deeper, east and southeast. High-altitude positions overlooking the border approaches. Positions that required climbing for hours, sometimes days, carrying limited supplies. Operating at elevations where helicopters could not reliably hover, forcing insertions kilometers away from final positions. They would not announce their presence. No large movements. No visible patrols. No heavy bombardment to signal intent. Because signaling intent collapses uncertainty. And uncertainty was the only advantage the mountain offered to those who understood it. The Afghan militias, in this model, would not be the primary containment force. They would be used selectively, blocking lower valleys, providing localized pressure to shape movement, not to define it. Their role would be controlled, not central. Air power would still exist, but its function would change. Instead of continuous bombardment, it would be held in reserve. On-call strikes directed by operators on the ground who had visual confirmation. AC-130 gunships used sparingly in windows where collateral damage and terrain masking could be managed. B-52 strikes limited to targets that were fixed, not assumed. The objective would shift from destroying a network inside the mountain to isolating the exits outside it. That shift sounds small. It isn't. It redefines success. Instead of measuring progress by caves destroyed or enemy fighters killed, success becomes the absence of movement across specific points. A man does not escape because he is intercepted at a pass that was never visible to the system before. This approach requires patience that large systems struggle to maintain. Hours without contact, days without visible progress. Operators sitting in sub-zero temperatures, wind cutting across exposed ridgelines, observing nothing but empty terrain, reporting nothing. From a distance, it looks like inactivity. Inside that silence, patterns begin to form. A single set of tracks, then another, hours later, following the same contour line. Movement at night, always between 0200 and 0400, when drone coverage is weakest and human fatigue is highest. No radio transmissions. No lights. Just disciplined, repeated behavior. That is when the system acts. Not broadly. Precisely. A blocking team shifts 300 meters to cover a secondary route identified through observation. A sniper pair establishes overwatch on a choke point where the terrain narrows to less than 20 meters between rock faces. Air support is pre-briefed, not requested in the moment. A laser designator already aligned to a grid reference that has been verified on the ground, not inferred from above. The engagement, when it happens, is brief. Because it is prepared. This doctrine does not eliminate risk. It concentrates it. Small teams operating beyond immediate support. Limited extraction options. Exposure to weather and isolation. If compromised, they cannot rely on rapid reinforcement. The chain of command must accept that risk in advance, not react to it after the fact. That acceptance was inconsistent in Tora Bora. Decisions were calibrated to avoid escalation, to manage political boundaries, to maintain control from a distance. The result was a system that retained authority but lost proximity. And proximity is where understanding lives. The alternative doctrine required giving that up. Not control entirely, but the illusion of it. Because in terrain like that, control is never absolute. It is negotiated between what you can see and what you are willing to trust your operators to do without asking. The units existed. The capability existed. What didn't align was the mindset. They were still trying to close a box, instead of realizing the box had never been there. The night they moved, there was no announcement. No shift in the air campaign. No change in the official picture. From above, the operation looked the same. Bombs continued to fall. AC-130 gunships traced slow circles, their sensors scanning for heat signatures that appeared and vanished between rock formations. But on the eastern face of Tora Bora, the pattern had already changed. It started just after 100. Temperature had dropped to -10 degrees Celsius. Wind moving across the ridgelines at 20 knots, enough to mask sound, not enough to erase tracks. Snow from 2 nights prior had hardened into a thin crust, breaking under weight, but holding shape long enough to preserve direction. Delta reconnaissance elements positioned on a western spur observed nothing unusual. Their sectors faced inward, toward cave complexes that had been bombarded for days. Thermal optics showed residual heat. Occasional movement. Nothing sustained. Because the movement wasn't there. It was happening laterally. Small groups, no more than 5 to 7 men, began crossing the high saddles leading southeast. They moved without radios. No electronic signature. Each man carried minimal load. AK pattern rifles, ammunition, winter clothing, and little else. Speed was not the priority. Silence was. At the center of one of those groups, a taller figure moved more slowly than the rest. He was not leading. He was being protected. The route had been prepared in advance. Not marked physically, but memorized. Guides from local tribes who had traversed these passes long before any modern military mapped them. They avoided ridgelines exposed to aerial observation, instead contouring along the sides, using shadow and terrain masking to break line of sight from above. Predator drones passed overhead every few hours. Their orbits were predictable, altitude fixed, sensor angles constrained by the terrain below. Between each pass, there were gaps. The movement fit inside those gaps. At 0217, Task Force Orange intercepted a brief transmission. Less than 2 seconds. A satellite phone activating, then cutting. The signal bounced, distorted by the terrain, but enough to register. Analysts flagged it as possible command coordination within the cave network. It wasn't. It was confirmation. A checkpoint passed. On the ground, no one adjusted. Because the intercept fed the existing model. Activity inside Tora Bora. Continued presence. Reinforcement of the same assumption. By 0300, the lead elements of the exfiltration had reached a narrow defile less than 15 meters wide. Steep rock walls on both sides. Elevation just under 11,500 feet. This was the critical point. Anyone observing from above that choke point could have closed it with a single well-placed team. 2 operators with precision rifles and a radio linked to pre-briefed air support. No one was there. The nearest American element was over 6 kilometers away, positioned to observe cave entrances that were no longer relevant. The group slowed. Spacing tightened. Movement became deliberate, each man stepping where the previous had stepped, minimizing new tracks. No conversation. Only hand signals, barely visible in the dark. Above them, an AC-130 adjusted orbit, responding to a request from an Afghan commander reporting contact further west. The gunship's sensors pivoted. Its attention shifted. The corridor opened. At 0345, the main body crossed the defile. No engagement. No illumination. No awareness. Behind them, a secondary group paused briefly. One of the fighters turned, scanning the ridge they had just left. Not out of fear. Out of habit. Then they continued. By first light, they were descending toward lower elevations leading into Pakistan's tribal areas. The terrain changed gradually. Slopes softened. Vegetation increased. Movement became easier. Faster. Still no radios. By 0600, predator coverage resumed over the primary cave complexes. Analysts noted reduced activity. Fewer heat signatures. Some entrances appeared collapsed from sustained bombing. The assessment began to shift. Enemy resistance degrading. Possible elimination of high-value targets. Reports moved up the chain. Bagram to CENTCOM. CENTCOM to Washington. Language remained cautious, but directionally confident. Meanwhile, Delta teams requested repositioning. Observations from the previous night did not align with the expected pattern. Tracks had been found where no movement was anticipated. Directional indicators pointing southeast. The request required approval. Approval required confirmation. Confirmation required time. By the time authorization came through, the terrain those tracks led to was already empty. CIA Special Activities Division officers attempted to re-engage Afghan sources in the eastern valleys. Information came back fragmented. Some reports of movement. Others denied it. Local dynamics shifted quickly. Tribes that might have observed the passage had no incentive to report it accurately. Some had facilitated it. Human intelligence, at that stage, lagged behind reality. Air power continued. At 0900, a series of strikes targeted remaining cave entrances based on coordinates refined over previous days. The explosions were precise, effective against fixed positions. There were no fixed positions left that mattered. By midday, Afghan commanders declared sections of the mountain cleared. Fighters moved into previously contested areas without resistance. Weapons caches were discovered. Abandoned equipment. Signs of recent occupation. But no target. The narrative adjusted slowly. Possibility of escape was introduced, not as a primary conclusion, but as a contingency. Language shifted from certainty to probability. Still controlled. Still measured. Because admitting movement meant acknowledging that the exits had never been sealed. On the ground, the absence was clear. No contact. No intercepts. No visual confirmation. Just empty terrain where there had been activity. By the time surveillance assets expanded their focus toward the border regions, the window had closed. Movement had transitioned from high-altitude exposure to low-altitude concealment. Villages, compounds, terrain broken by human structures. Areas where aerial surveillance lost clarity and human networks determined visibility. The man they had compressed an entire operation around was no longer in the system they had built to contain him. He had passed through it. Not by force. By alignment. Every decision made above the mountain had shaped his path. Every delay, every assumption, every request that stopped one level short of action. He did not break the perimeter. He walked through the space where it was never established. And by the time the system recognized the absence, it was no longer a tactical problem. It had become something else entirely. By the evening of December 16th, the language changed. Not abruptly. Not publicly. Inside briefings, the tone shifted first. Degraded presence became uncertain location. Contained became likely dispersed. The system did not announce failure. It reclassified it. At Bagram Air Base, situation reports continued to arrive on schedule. Predator feeds still looped over the same grid squares. Analysts annotated images of cratered ridgelines and collapsed cave entrances. The visual evidence supported the narrative. Destruction was measurable. Absence was not. CENTCOM received the updates with cautious acknowledgement. No definitive confirmation of the target. No body. No intercept that could be validated beyond probability. The chain of command did not break. It adjusted its posture. Requests began to surface. Authorization to expand operations toward the Pakistani border. Increased surveillance over known crossing routes. Diplomatic channels opened quietly, probing for cooperation that had not been secured before the operation began. But expansion after movement is reaction. The timeline had already shifted beyond reach. On the ground, Delta Force elements conducted follow-on sweeps. Systematic. Methodical. Moving through cave complexes that had been reduced by days of bombardment. They found weapons, ammunition, documents, medical supplies, evidence of occupation that ended recently enough to be felt, not seen. Fires that had burned out hours earlier. Equipment left behind because it slowed movement. Nothing that anchored a target. The absence was consistent. CIA Special Activities Division officers debriefed Afghan commanders again. The answers changed subtly. Some acknowledged that fighters had moved east. Others claimed ignorance. A few suggested that the primary objective had been achieved, that the network had been broken, leadership scattered. No one could point to a location, because location no longer existed in a form the system could act on. Task Force Orange continued signals monitoring. The pattern they had relied on, brief satellite phone activations, fragmented voice transmissions, had collapsed. Not degraded. Silenced. Whether by intent or necessity, the network had adapted. Couriers replaced electronics. Messages moved physically, across terrain that no sensor could intercept in real time. The system that had tracked him could no longer see him. In Washington, the assessment process became more deliberate. Language mattered. Conclusions carried weight beyond the battlefield. Declaring success required evidence. Declaring failure required accountability. So neither was declared. Instead, the operation was framed as ongoing. The pursuit extended beyond Tora Bora. The objective remained active. The outcome deferred. But inside closed rooms, the understanding was already forming. He was gone. Not confirmed. Not officially, but operationally undeniable. The consequences unfolded in layers. Immediate tactical momentum dissipated. Units that had been concentrated on a single objective began to disperse. Focus shifted to broader counterterrorism operations across Afghanistan. Resources reallocated. Priorities adjusted. The mountain, once the center of gravity, became another cleared battle space. But it had not delivered what it was supposed to deliver. The failure was not visible in terrain. It was visible in what was missing from it. No confirmation. No closure. No end state that matched the scale of effort applied. The system had executed with precision inside its own framework. Air power had been effective. Ground units had operated within their orders. Intelligence had been collected, processed, and acted upon according to established procedures. Everything worked. Except the outcome. Because the outcome depended on something that had never been secured. Control of movement. By the time that gap was fully acknowledged, it was no longer a gap. It was distance. Measured not in kilometers, but in time. Time that could not be reversed. Time that had already been used. What followed was not immediate correction. It was adaptation. Slow. Reluctant. Structural. Because systems like that do not admit error in the moment. They absorb it. They redistribute it across doctrine, training, and language until the original failure becomes something else. A lesson. A case study. A quiet reference point in rooms where decisions are made differently the next time. Tora Bora did not end the war. It changed how the war understood itself. Before that mountain, the belief was still intact. That overwhelming force, combined with superior technology, could compress any target into a fixed point. That surveillance could substitute for presence. That patterns observed from distance could define reality on the ground. They had everything, and it had almost worked. Almost became the most dangerous word in that system. Because almost success reinforces the method. It delays the question. After Tora Bora, the question could no longer be avoided. Not publicly, but internally, it reshaped everything. JSOC began to shift its operational posture. Not in announcements, but in allocation. More authority pushed downward to unit commanders in the field. Pre-approved targeting authorities expanded. The delay between observation and action shortened, not through faster communication, but through reduced need for it. Task Force Orange refined its role. Signals intelligence was no longer treated as confirmation. It became a starting point. Something to be verified physically, not trusted in isolation. Intercepts were cross-referenced with human sources that were embedded deeper, longer, quieter. Because they understood what had happened. They had been listening to echoes inside a system that had already moved. CIA Special Activities Division expanded its footprint differently. Less emphasis on rapid penetration. More on persistence. Building networks that existed before operations began, not during them. Relationships that could reveal movement not after it happened, but as it was being prepared. That required time. Time that had not been invested before Tora Bora. Delta Force adjusted in ways that were less visible, but more significant. Their reconnaissance elements were given greater priority, not as support, but as the main effort in certain operations. Blocking positions, once considered secondary to assault, became primary objectives. Because the lesson was clear. If you control where a man can go, you do not need to chase where he is. Air power changed its role as well. Not reduced, but redefined. B-52 strikes and large-scale bombardment were no longer default responses to uncertainty. They became tools applied after confirmation, not before. AC-130 gunships were integrated more tightly with ground units that had visual control, not used to search for targets in terrain that concealed more than it revealed. The system did not abandon technology. It repositioned it. From dominance to support. Because technology had not failed. It had been asked to do something it could not do. Understand terrain it could not feel. The broader strategy shifted too. Border regions, once treated as edges of the battlefield, became central. Not politically, not publicly, but operationally. Persistent surveillance expanded. Agreements, formal and informal, were pursued with greater urgency. Not because sovereignty had changed, but because the cost of ignoring those spaces had been measured. In absence, years later, when operations like the raid in Abbottabad were executed, the difference was visible to those who knew where to look. No reliance on signals intercepts alone. No assumption of containment without physical confirmation. Human intelligence developed over years. Surveillance conducted from proximity, not distance. A single compound observed repeatedly, patterns established, behavior understood before action was taken. And when the operation moved, it did not ask for permission at every step. It executed within an intent that had already accepted the risk. That shift did not begin in Abbottabad. It began in failure. But the most important transformation was less technical. It was conceptual. They stopped believing that control could be imposed from above. They started understanding that control had to be built from within the environment they were operating in. That meant accepting limits. Not everything could be seen. Not everything could be predicted. And not every target could be fixed in place just because the system needed it to be. Tora Bora remained what it was. A mountain range where one of the most resourced military efforts in modern history focused its attention, applied its power, and still failed to close the only paths that mattered. The failure was not in the execution of orders. It was in the design of them. They had constructed a reality that made sense from a distance, and then tried to fight inside it. The man they were hunting did not defeat them. He moved through the space they chose not to see. And in that space, the system learned something it would carry forward, quietly, into every operation that followed. Power does not create control. Understanding does. And understanding begins where assumption ends.